We all want to study smarter, not harder. But with so many study techniques out there, active recall, spaced repetition, you name it, how do you know which ones are actually improving your learning and which ones might not be as effective as they seem? If you're new here, hi, I'm Anna, a master's student who spent years testing different learning strategies to find the most effective ways to study. That's why today I'll be ranking 7 of the most popular study methods and giving you my honest review. Before we dive into each technique, let me quickly go through 3 criteria I'll be using to rank them. First, effectiveness. How well does the technique actually help you to understand and learn the material? Second, simplicity. Is it easy to integrate into your study routine, or does it feel too complex? And time investment. Does it take up a reasonable amount of time, or is it too demanding for the results it provides? Okay, with that covered, let's go into the first technique. The first technique is spaced repetition, one of the popular and evidence-based techniques out there. If you've ever heard about the forgetting curve, which is how quickly we lose information over time, spaced repetition is basically designed to fight against it. So instead of learning everything in one sitting, like the night before the exam, the idea is to review material at increasing intervals to reinforce your memory just as you're about to forget it. For example, by reviewing the material after 1 hour, 1 day, 7 days, 30 days, you will remember it much better in the long term. And the common way to use this technique is with flashcards through apps like Anki or Quizlet, but you don't have to use any app if you don't want to implement this method in your studies. Okay, as for the metrics, I gave spaced repetition technique a 9 out of 10 for effectiveness, as it's a proved way to retain information long term, but of course as long as you already understand the material well. For simplicity aspect, I rated it as a 6 out of 10 because it's a straightforward method, but it does require a lot of dedication over a period of time. You have to start learning the concept early on, then stick to the scheduled reviews, and it can be tough, especially for procrastinators like me. And in terms of time investment, I gave spaced repetition a 7 out of 10. On one hand, it requires multiple revision sessions over time, making it a long-term commitment rather than a one intense study session. But if you apply it correctly, meaning you understand the forgetting curve and you space things out efficiently, the actual time reviewing can be surprisingly low, making it a solid balance between the time invested and the long-term retention. Now, let's move on to highlighting, one of the most common techniques out there. It's very simple. You just take a highlighter and you mark the important sections as you read. You can highlight anywhere and in any way, digitally, in a notebook, using different colors or just a pen. It's quite quick, easy, and honestly looks nice. So it makes sense why so many students rely on this technique as their main study strategy. But here's the thing. For effectiveness, I would rate it as low as 4 out of 10. The problem is it feels very productive in the moment, but in reality it's a very passive study technique. Unless you combine it with other strategies like self-testing or active recall and so on, you're not truly engaging with information. And that means you are more likely to forget it. Okay, when it comes to simplicity, I rated it a 10 out of 10. It's very easy to implement in your studies, doesn't require much effort, and is quite a passive technique, which is exactly why so many students rely on it, and also the main catch. It's true that you might require some sort of strategy or system to separate different types of key learnings, or to avoid highlighting the wrong things, or avoid highlighting too much, but overall it's still a very easy and enjoyable thing to do. For the time investment criteria, I gave highlighting a 5 out of 10. That's because it doesn't take much time to highlight, but the trade-off is that the time you spend highlighting doesn't really bring much result in terms of information retention unless you apply other learning strategies or revisit the highlighted information. So I would say, while highlighting has potential, especially if combined with other techniques, just highlighting as a technique itself is a poor investment of your time for effective studying, especially compared to other options we have. Speaking of which, the next technique I want to review is called memory palace. It's basically a type of memorization technique where you mentally place pieces of information that you would like to remember in specific locations in a familiar space. For example, walking through your house and putting different concepts in each room. This study technique is based on the idea that our brains remember images and locations better than more abstract information like names and numbers. So for effectiveness, I rated Memory Palace as a 10 out of 10 because it's an amazing method backed by research studies. One study found that the recall of those who applied this method improved by 22% over conventional study methods, which speaks for itself. Memory Palace is also quite effective for organizing high volumes of information. For example, if you're a medical student, I think this method would be extremely helpful. To continue, I gave Memory Palace a 4 out of 10 for simplicity. While it seems straightforward, actually applying it to your study routine might take some practice. You have to create a familiar mental space, assign information to different locations, and then mentally walk through it to recall the details. It also might be difficult to apply this method to more complex subjects and organize everything in a way that makes sense, and also requires some effort and strong visualization skills. For time investment, I rated Memory Palace a solid 8. It doesn't actually take up that much time. Effort, yes, but in terms of time, visualizing can be pretty quick, especially once you get the hang of it. And considering the results it gives you, the time spent is definitely worth it. I would say this technique is especially valuable if you want to memorize something for the long term, but it's probably not the best choice for last-minute exam preparation. The next study technique on the list is active recall. If you've ever heard that testing yourself is the best way to study, this is exactly that. Instead of just reading or passively reviewing material, active recall forces you to retrieve information from memory. For example, by using flashcards, practice questions, or even closing your eyes and trying to write down everything you can remember. For effectiveness, I gave active recall a 10 out of 10. It's easily one of the most powerful techniques out there, backed by loads of research. Because when you actively test yourself, you're not just reviewing information. You are strengthening those neural connections, making it way easier to recall later. In terms of simplicity, I gave it a 4. I think the idea itself is simple, but actually implementing it takes a lot of effort. It's quite a painful process. Unlike passive studying, you have to actively challenge yourself, which isn't always comfortable. For time investment, though, I'm giving it a solid 10 out of 10 again. It might take more effort upfront, but it ultimately saves you a lot of time by making your study sessions more efficient. Instead of endlessly rereading notes, you're ensuring that what you're learning actually sticks, meaning less time spent relearning later. Now let's talk about the Feynman Technique, which is all about trying to explain the concept you're studying in simple terms, as if you were teaching it to someone else. The idea is that if you can't explain it simply, you probably don't understand it well enough. This way, you know exactly what you need to focus on in your next study session. Okay, for effectiveness, I rated this one as a 7 out of 10. It's a very nice technique for developing a deep understanding of the concept rather than just memorizing facts. And when you break things down into your own words, you're forced to process the information in a much more meaningful way. But of course, the Feynman technique doesn't really help with memorization and recall as much as some other techniques. For simplicity, I gave it 8 out of 10. You don't need any fancy tools to use this method. You can do it out loud to yourself, write it down, or even teach a friend. I especially like this approach as studying with friends is simply more fun, and by explaining the topic in your own words, you're actually helping both your friend and yourself to understand the topic better. The tricky part is making sure you understand the concept well before you try to explain it, which can sometimes expose gaps in knowledge, and then you actually have to focus on these weaknesses. As for time investment, I gave it a 6. It's definitely useful, but it can take time, especially for difficult topics. You might need to go back, review, simplify, and explain multiple times before things really click. But that's also why it's so worth it for the long-term understanding. Let's continue with technique number 6, the Pomodoro technique, which is a popular time management strategy used by students. It's based on working in short, focused bursts of usually 25 minutes, followed by short breaks. For effectiveness, I would say Pomodoro technique is not perfect, around 4 out of 10. It's great for staying focused, especially if you struggle with distractions, but for subjects that require deep, uninterrupted thinking, the frequent breaks can sometimes feel disruptive. Personally, I find that 25 minutes study sessions don't work very well because it takes me time to enter this flow state, and just as I get into the zone, the timer goes off. That being said, if your study task is simple or repetitive, or if you adjust the session length to better match your concentration span, Pomodoro technique can still be effective. For simplicity, I gave it an 8 out of 10. All you need is a timer. So on one hand, it's very easy to set up and follow, which is why so many people use it to boost productivity. But at the same time, it does require some good time management and discipline. So going back to the flow state after a break might feel a bit challenging. In terms of time investment, I gave it a 6. Pomodoro's structured breaks help to prevent burnout, which is great for maintaining a long-term productivity. But the rigid timing doesn't always align with your natural focus cycle. So sometimes you will need a longer deep work session, while other times you might need a shorter study session. So if the technique doesn't fit your personal rhythm, you might end up wasting time transitioning in and out of focus. That said, for anyone who struggles with procrastination or loses track of time, Pomodoro can be a valuable way to maximize the study hours. And now let's talk about mind mapping, a technique which helps you to visually organize information. Instead of listing facts in a linear way, many students like to create a nice, colorful diagram with the main topic at the center and branch out into key ideas, subtopics, and connections. This way, it's easier to see how everything links together. For effectiveness, I rated it as a 6 out of 10. Mind mapping is a nice way to understand the relationship between concepts, especially for subjects that require big picture thinking. But it might not be the most efficient method for straight memorization. For instance, for subjects that are more fact-heavy. Personally, I think mind maps can be especially useful for the initial brainstorming and rough organization of complex topics. In terms of simplicity, I gave mind mapping a 7 out of 10. The concept is easy to grasp and you don't need any fancy tools other than paper. But creating a well-structured mind map does take an effort, and if it gets too cluttered, it can be overwhelming rather than helpful. Also, for some people like me, mind maps can feel a bit too overwhelming compared to the organized structure of simple lists. For time investment, I rated it as 5 out of 10. Mind maps can take longer to create compared to traditional notes, but the visual connections can help with the overall understanding. If you tend to forget isolated facts, this technique can actually save time in the long run by reinforcing knowledge in a visual way. So, after reviewing all 7 study techniques, what is the main insight? Well, looking at the ratings, active recall comes out on top, scoring 22 out of 30, the highest across simplicity, effectiveness, and time investment metrics. I guess it's not surprising, as it's a study technique backed by research, and it actively strengthens memory. But that, of course, doesn't mean it's the only option. It's important to understand what study tactics are out there and to know what their focus is. knowing that you can experiment and see what works best for you. For example, if your goal is long-term retention, spaced repetition is a close second, reinforcing what you've learned over time. Or for deep understanding of the concepts, the Feynman technique helps to break down complex ideas and see your problem areas. At the end of the day, there's no one size fits all. The best study method really depends on your learning style and also what you're studying. In fact, I personally believe that experimenting and combining different learning strategies is often the most powerful approach, which now brings us to the end of this video. If you've gotten this far, I would love to hear a comment from you about your preferred study techniques, and also if you have any suggestion on what video you would like to see next. Feel free to like and subscribe for more study tips. Thank you so much for watching. Have a lovely day and see you in the next video. Bye bye.